Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us at the Coding Zoo. This is your first time joining. My name is Shane, and this is the JavaScript Building Blocks playlist. In this playlist, we learn how to use JavaScript one feature, one video at a time. In today's lesson, we're going to learn about scope. What is scope inside of JavaScript? What are the different scopes? I hope that interests you. It's very important to understand scope when you're programming in JavaScript. We're going to jump right into that. Before we do, I just want to mention, hey, if you haven't checked out thecodingzoo.com, check it out. If you want to learn how to become a programmer, it's a good field to get into. I think it was said by 2020 there'd be 1 million jobs in the US alone that aren't filled. So we need programmers. That's our goal. The Coding Zoo, great programmer. Let's jump in. So on my desktop, I have the Coding Zoo JavaScript folder 13 I created from my template, which you can learn how to create in our first video of this playlist. It contains a main.js file where we actually will program. Here's an index file that actually includes that main.js file, which we will run to see what happens when we program. Here is that file open in the browser. Let's jump in. I'm going to create a variable called add. Let's make an arrow function. First number, comma, second number, equals, greater than sign, squiggly bracket, end squiggly bracket. I'm going to call it add 5 and 15. In this arrow function, I'm going to create another variable called sum. It's going to equal the first number plus second number. And now I'm going to call that function, and now I'm going to print out to my document using the document object and the write function on that object. I'm going to print out that variable sum. Click save. Okay, let's go ahead and refresh, see what happens. Click refresh, and nothing happened. Nothing was printed out. So this wasn't a bug. I did this on purpose to show you what happens when you use scope incorrectly. So here's the error. Uncaught reference error. Sum is not defined. So I defined the variable sum in the scope of the function add. So since I defined it inside of this function, code outside of this function can't read it. So this is what scope is all about. This is a good thing, right? You want to keep variables scoped as small as possible. What if we have tons of code and the variable sum is used for different reasons all over the code? Well, they kind of clash. We don't want that. So you want to keep your variables scoped to the smallest chunk of logic that you can. Functions are great for that. Objects are great for that. We're going to cover objects later on, hopefully soon. So let's try another way. Now, I don't recommend this way, but just so you understand scope. I'm going to call it add numbers. I'm going to reuse the same code, but I'm going to take the let for sum, and I'm going to put it outside the function. There we go. Let num equals 0. Here's my new function called add number. Takes in the two params. It sets the variable sum by adding those two parameters. Will this work? Well, a function does have access to the scope outside of it. So it's not a good thing to do it this way, but it will work, I think. Let's see. Let's go ahead and call it. Go ahead and print it out, and we will see. Let's go ahead and comment out that first code, the first bit of code, since we know it fails. Let's go ahead and run this code. There you go. So I defined the variable up here, and it's what's called basically global scope. I created a function that function changed that global variable, and we were able to write the global variable outside of that function. I wouldn't recommend this, and why would I not recommend this again? You don't want your variables all to be defined in global scope, because then you have clashing, and things can change those variables, and you won't know which piece of code did that. It's usually better to keep things within a certain scope and to keep them basically abstracted, hidden from other pieces of your code. In our previous lessons, we learned how to create variables using keywords such as var and let. What's the difference in var and let? We never did really discuss that in depth. Well, one of the main differences is scope. Let's look into that real quick. I'm going to cut and paste a little bit of code. I recommend that you pause the video and actually write the code out yourself and try it out. So here's my function that I just cut and pasted. Now I've named this function var assignment test. So we're going to test out how var works. So I have a variable apple count equals 3, a variable apples spoiled equals 1. In previous lessons, we learned how to do comparisons, and we learned how to use the if statement. So I've got if apples spoiled is greater than 0. Well, let's change the apple count. I have variable apple count equals apple count minus the spoiled. And then in the function, I have document write, and I'm writing out the good apple count. Let's go ahead and call that function. And by the way, you really shouldn't do this. This isn't a clean way of doing things. If I wanted to write this a little bit cleaner, I wouldn't define that variable twice. But this is, of course, again, as a test. Just want to show you how var works. All right, so let's call it. So I have 2 good apples. It was able to actually calculate the good apples and change the apple count here. Now what I did here is I basically created a new variable here, and I printed it out outside of that if block. Now, this is a code block. It's an if block, right? I was able to basically redefine this apple count using this statement, and this statement is defined inside of this if block. Basically throwing away the old variable, creating a new one inside this if block. And this variable, it was accessible outside of a code block. Var was accessible outside of a code block. Now let's try another example. Let's use let. I'm going to cut and paste it. Don't forget to actually pause the video, type it out. You want to get used to typing it out so you understand the code easily. I'm going to cut and paste it. I have a new function called let assignment test. I use let for the variables instead of var, and I have if apple spoiled is greater than 0, then let apple count equals apple count minus apple spoiled, same as before. And we'll document write it out in the function. Let's go ahead and call the function. I'm going to save, click refresh, see what happens. And nothing happened. So let's look at it. Console, apple count is not defined. So it tried to create the new apple count, just like the var did. So it tried to create the new apple count using the previous apple count. Well, it couldn't do that because when this statement ran, the new apple count variable wasn't completely defined yet. It kind of clashed with itself, so that won't work. Let's go ahead and try another example just to make this code work so I can show you how scope works. All right, so I'm going to change it to let apple count equals the 3 minus apples spoiled. Now, when I run this, it should say apple count should be 3 minus what? 1, which equals 2. Let's see, with the var, it equaled 2. Let's see what it equals here. So click refresh, and the good apples are 3. Well, what happened? I set a variable apple count here of 3. I have a code block. The function is a code block. The if statement is a code block, the squiggly lines. I have a different code block. var was accessible all throughout this function. So variables created with let are constrained to the code block. So I have a variable up here called apple count, and I have another variable called apple count here. They're not the same variables. So when I write it out, it's writing the first one. It's not writing the second one here. So that's the difference in var and let. Let is better for keeping variables within their scope of where they should be kept. Let is usually better to use. I recommend using it instead of var in most cases. So let's see if this is actually a different variable. Can I make it print out? Let's try it. I'm going to go inside of that if block scope and print it out there. Click refresh. And there we go. We have another 2 one, and then we have the 3 one. So that's it. That's the difference in let and var. And this is how scope works. Scope is constrained to your code blocks. Your code blocks are usually the places in your code where you have beginning squiggly bracket and ending squiggly bracket. If I did an if else here, which we learned about in different previous lessons, if else has 2 squiggly bracket sections. Those are different scopes. So that's how scope works. That's the difference in let and var. I hope that makes sense to you. If not, leave me a question below. I'll get back to you and explain it. I hope you enjoyed the video. Do you understand why it's important? Do you understand why it's important to keep variables down to a minimum scope? Let me know below if you understand that, if that makes sense to you. If not, I'll get back to you and we'll explain it in more detail. Okay, thanks for joining. I hope this was a good lesson for you. I enjoyed it. I hope to see you next time. Click subscribe, click like, and come visit us again. Talk to you later. Bye.